use the 10-minute option to discuss some of the contradiction and the perpetuating of the gender binary that exists within Twin Flames and the Event by Jen McCarty. If you saw the last two parts of this series, then we looked at first at Jen McCarty's interpretation of the scientific concept of codons. And the reason I did that is because I can literally show you with a very simple, basic Google search and a TikTok video that educates people about what codons are, that it would have been very, very easy for her to confirm some of this knowledge that she was getting before she wrote a book about it and told you that these are the facts behind the twin flame journey. And the reason I did that is because it's important for you to understand that if a person is claiming the information that they're receiving is truly this sacred knowledge, then it should gel with a lot of people's experiences and observations. And it should definitely be something that we could observe in nature if they're talking about something that can be observed in nature, which is in fact what she was doing when she was referring to codons and her idea of how they worked in terms of DNA. So Jen McCarty doesn't really give us anything new in terms of creation. We have the white ovoid sphere that Elizabeth Clare Prophet talked about and Madame Blavatsky before her. And as you know from the beginning of the series, that whole story of the two souls is coming most likely from Plato's myth of Aristophanes, which, again, if you didn't see it, is a myth. It was not meant to be considered a religious or sacred or even metaphysical text. It was meant for philosophical dialogue about the origins, really, of homosexuality, and it did not have a lot to do with, our spiritual state at all. That was not Plato's intention. So right away, she's perpetuating that same idea that the myth of the twin souls is somehow this actual real thing that happened at the beginning of time. So she explains to us that the original white ovoid sphere of light split into masculine and feminine in order to experience itself. Then she goes on to say that the first souls separated from this, masculine and feminine energy were themselves androgynous. This is a common thing. We see this also with the stories about angels being androgynous and then humans not being androgynous anymore. What's interesting about that is that in nature, the biological sex binary is just as fluid as the gender binary is. And it's important to note that this idea of things being black or white, masculine or feminine, this or that, this is a tendency that humans have in order to categorize. And one of the things that we do as we interact with our environment is one of the things that we excel at, I should say, is pattern recognition. And so in order for us to feel a sense of order, we tend to separate things into categories. And this is just seemingly part of human nature. But what biology, in fact, tells us is that those binaries really are not accurate. Things in our reality exist much more in gray areas, and there's much more fluidity in these concepts than we were led to believe. And the reason that we were led to believe in those binaries is because it's much easier and simpler to explain and define, and it makes people feel more comfortable to have a sense of this or that. And it is where we get into a place where things are not this or that people start to lose their sense of stability and their sense of reality. And I believe that one of our jobs as healers, readers, spiritual guides for other people now in this day and age is to help them navigate those spaces which are much more fluid than we were ever led to believe by the Christian rhetoric that most of us have lived with in our current society, at least in the United States. What I do know is that there are traits of masculine and feminine energy there are those extremes in nature where we can define certain behaviors, ideas, concepts, etc. on either end of an extreme, while still acknowledging that everything exists sort of along this line. The best example I have of that is there's hot and cold, and both of those things describe temperature. So there's masculine and feminine, and both of those things describe the energy that exists inside of every being. Now, Jen McCarty probably would not argue that with me, nor would Elizabeth Clare Prophet, because that's part of the contradiction that you often find in these texts, where on the one hand, they will tell you that there are these masculine and feminine binaries, and then out of the other side of their mouth they will say, oh, but at least in Jen McCarty's case, she will say that people will experience this polarity regardless of their sexual biology. While she does make this declaration, she also goes on to refer to masculines as men. On page 45, she says, "It is a very rare man who is able to fully surrender to a truly awakened divine feminine, due to there being a limited number of divine feminines that are truly awakened on the third dimension." There's so many problems with this statement. In the chapter where this comes from, which is called The Spiritual Dynamics Between the Masculine and Feminine, she is perpetuating the most patriarchal and limiting ideas about feminine gendered identifying individuals that I cannot understand how, when someone reading this text would not conclude that it is actually the antithesis of spiritual alignment and union within. She tells us that divine feminine or mother energy is all about being in service at all times to all souls. She then goes on to say that divine feminine's evolution is to be the spiritual protector for her divine masculine. Remember, she's not talking about the masculine and feminine energy within everyone, which she starts to talk about, but then quickly deviates from that path and goes on to just talk about the divine feminines, which you could say are women in her mind, and masculines who are men in her mind. And while she may accept transgender people as feminine or masculine identifying people, she very much distinguishes two separate roles for people who identify as feminine and people who identify as masculine. Part of what's going on is that Jen McCarty simply doesn't understand a lot of the spiritual concepts that she refers to, but then says that she doesn't refer to because she doesn't regurgitate other information. But she'll say about the masculine that the myth is depicted throughout most ancient cultures that have held on to this knowing and remembrance that the divine masculine is truly born when he surrenders and allows his egoic consciousness to die, to be reborn through the guidance, love, and abiding wisdom of the truly awakened divine feminine. What she's not acknowledging in this passage is that has always been an internal process. The ancient cultures that she's referring to, when they were referring to the ego, we're not talking about a divine masculine gender identifying individual or polarity. They were talking about the energy of the mind versus the energy of the heart. The feminine energy is supposed to be the inner energy, and the masculine is the outward energy. It's the projection into the 3D. So this process she describes isn't anything about a feminine identifying woman being somehow responsible for a masculine identifying man and their spiritual ascension. Every human being's spiritual ascension is supposed to happen within self. And there is not a single ancient culture that has ever contradicted that concept. So right away, we can see that Jen McCarty simply doesn't understand the process of masculine and feminine union being about a release of the ego and an acceptance of the one consciousness that our body and our minds have hold over us, but what's truly important is what's within us.